So I'm John Taylor, and along with Amy, co-chairing this new working group on technology, economics, and governance. I'm very excited about a very important time, and we couldn't be more pleased and excited to have Michael Mcconnell be our first speaker. So as you know, Michael is a professor right here at Stanford, the law school. I shouldn't say right here, as I'm somewhere else on the campus, and former federal judge who knows a lot about the law, more than anybody probably. But for most important for what we're talking about today, was one of the co-chairs of the Facebook Oversight Board, which has had a huge amount of importance and publicity and discussion and criticism and praise already. So we're very happy to have Michael join us. There's a title, the Facebook Oversight Board Process Decisions and Reactions. So it covers the gamut. So Michael will lead off with a few opening remarks and comments. I think we're welcome to jump in at any time, but most of the questions and comments will come after. And then Condi will come in and say a few words. And Amy will direct the Q&A. And if you have questions, just use your mechanical hand or scream or whatever you want. We're keeping the group pretty small and concise, but jump in at any time. Is there economic issues, governance issues, security issues, privacy issues, you name it. And we're just so pleased to start off with Michael Mcconnell. Judge, why don't you begin?
Well, thank you. It's really an honor to kick off this working group. Particularly any working group with the word technology in the title, since I am probably the biggest techno ignoramus in all of Hoover. So I'm extremely interested in this Oversight Board project, but more from a point of view of governance, maybe a little bit from the point of view of economics, and especially from the sort of broad sweep of freedom of the press and speech in our society. It seems grandiose, but I think it is nonetheless true that our society is undergoing a transformation as a result of social media that is unprecedented since the first big technological convulsion in the communication space, namely the printing press. And the printing press had all kinds of ramifications, and including the rise of republicanism, the Protestant Reformation, the decline in absolutist government, and so forth. And I think it's just as at that time, the questions of institutions to control this new medium of communication were really more important than questions of substance. I think that may turn out to be true today of social media. That is, when the printing press first came to England in the 15th century, well, the government was a little slow to respond, but soon the Crown imposed licensing for the purpose of advanced censorship. And so printers were not able to print material without having permission of the Crown to do this. And in the late 17th century, partly because of the advocacy of the poet John Milton, who wrote the first important defense of freedom of the press, and partly because of the extraordinary convulsions that were in that time. That was also the time of the Glorious Revolution. Britain evolved into a system with what they regarded as freedom of the press. Now, much more limited than what we would say, but the key element was that instead of having a central Crown-appointed censor, limitations on what you could publish were enforced in court in front of juries. And this was the key thing. It wasn't substance. It wasn't, more liberal rules about what you could say. It was that juries, rather than a centralized censor, would be the decision maker. Well, fast forward now to social media. Who is going to be the decision maker? There's little doubt, I think, that as a practical matter, what can be said over social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, other somewhat less important platforms, that is really the way in which people communicate today. Ordinary people and politicians too. It's just in this very short period of time has become the leading medium of communication for our society. And just as has always been the case, that means that there are going to be some gatekeepers. Who are they going to be? And up until now, the gatekeepers have been the companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc. And they've done pretty much what they want. Now, when I say what they want, that's powerfully shaped by the market. This is where the second word in our working group's title comes in, economics, because the companies are partially motivated, I suspect, by ideology, but primarily motivated by a desire to cultivate a more profitable enterprise. And that involves pleasing their users, but pleasing them in a very peculiar way. It's not quite conforming to user desires, but rather to cultivating user reaction, so that there's the companies make more money if there are more clicks, if there are more likes, if there are more shares. And so there is a built-in bias in the system in favor of what we pejoratively would call virality. That is, for messages that get people excited and get them to react. And we know from human psychology that is not always, that doesn't necessarily mean positive. People do, of course, react to cute cat videos, and there's plenty of that on social media. But they also react to outrage and anger and demagoguery, which and so it's a weird kind of consumer demand. So we're looking at an economics here that is not quite the same as consumer-driven economics, in which we can say that a product has more value when it has a larger share of the market. Instead, we have a product which is, I think, morally and democratically ambiguous with respect to this. But so the companies have essentially been able to make these decisions on an arbitrary basis, and they have not, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anyone, they have not done a very good job. If you look at, say, the community standards, I know Facebook's the best, but I don't think the other companies have been a lot better. The Facebook community standards are vague and confusing. And they do not show, you can tell that they have not been written by either lawyers or philosophers with any great experience in free speech issues, because they recommit so many of the mistakes that have been made over the last several hundred years about the regulation of speech. And so they have the rules themselves are very poorly drafted, but then the magnitude of the problem of enforcement is just unfathomable and maybe unsolvable. I mean, this is not Facebook's issue or Twitter's fault, but the sheer volume of the of posts on these social media is such that trying to bring coherence and consistency and rationality to the gatekeeping function is just it's just it's an unfathomably difficult problem. Facebook employs something like 30,000 human content moderators around the world, many of whom are not in the United States. And then on top of that, the vast majority of the working decisions, up or down, will this be allowed on or not, are made by machines through artificial intelligence. And there have been many of the most idiotic decisions and problems that have occurred come because machines are not actually very good at things like, I'm going to mention a little bit later a case about satire. Well, machines are very bad at appreciating satire, and yet we know from hundreds of years of experience how important satire is as a type of democratic communication. So in terms of basic, at the sort of 30,000 foot view of institutions and who can be the decision makers, there are basically four choices. One possibility that a lot of people think that they would support is something like a free speech model, a First Amendment model, where nobody is the gatekeeper. You can basically say anything that isn't illegal, and where illegal is governed by the same standards of free speech under the First Amendment that speech out on the sidewalk is governed by. That model may seem superficially attractive, but it has some real problems, because I think it's just simply true that social media couldn't survive under that. Take for example spam. If the companies didn't censor spam, the service would become unusable. And yet spam is not a First Amendment category. It's people out on a soapbox at Hyde Park can spam as much as they want. Spam is constitutionally protected, but it has to be eliminated. And there are, pornography, short of being obscene, pornography is protected. And yet when families use Facebook, they don't want themselves and their children to be bombarded with this. It's a huge factor on the internet, but it is not a factor on Facebook. And that is, I think most Facebook users would view that as a virtue, not as an oppressive aspect of censorship. And perhaps most clearly, the business model of social media is not an unfettered free speech model. What they do is they prioritize messages so that each user receives the message and high in their feed according to what they want and according to what the company guesses that they might want. Well, that involves content discrimination at its very core. But that's the service that these companies are providing. They are not just Hyde Park, where you go from one person on a crate to the next and so forth. That's not what Facebook or Twitter or YouTube is like. They curate what comes to each individual on an individualized basis. So this idea that it could simply be, we could dispense with gatekeeping is really not, I think, a realistic option. Well, the second, possibility is the government could be the gatekeeper. And there are bunches of people who think this is a good idea. A lot of them are in Congress. Mark Zuckerberg has said that he thinks that there should be more regulation. But I think also a fairly quick, thinking about this will suggest that this presents some really serious problems. For one thing, the anti-democratic tyranny problems are much more severe if it's the government doing this. We might possibly, maybe, be able to survive it in the United States, where there's a strong culture of freedom of speech, maybe. But these companies are all over the world, and government regulation in places like India or China or Turkey would not look like what people want. But also in the I'm going to use the perhaps politically incorrect term, the free world. In the free world, where we do have First Amendment type limitations on government control of speech, a government regulation would be impossible legally without becoming something like the first alternative. That as soon as the government gets involved in telling the companies what kind of speech to put up and to take down, the First Amendment will kick in, and we won't be able to do the kind of limitation that I think most users want. Well, we could also just leave it to the companies. They haven't done a very good job. I think their incentives are not aligned with the public interest. We've talked about this at the beginning, and I won't belabor the point. Well, the Oversight Board is, I think, a very creative, experimental fourth answer to this, which may work and may not. But essentially what Facebook has done is that it has created a body of independent outsiders with a range of expertise, and has publicly pledged to let that outside group be the final word as to takedowns and leave ups on the platform. And in addition, to recommend policy changes to the company, which the company is free to take or not, but they have pledged within 30 days to, in a public, written, transparent way, to say what they're going to do about those policy recommendations. So, and thus far, Facebook has accepted the vast majority of those policy recommendations. So who, this is a little bit like taking the power away from the arbitrary censor named by the Crown and empowering juries, except that the Oversight Board isn't as democratic as a jury. It's really a more of a worldwide, at least somewhat objective body of people who have no commitment at all to the economic interests of the companies, but rather to civil society in their various countries. So Facebook started this. A lot of people wonder, could it possibly be independent when Facebook started it and basically brought these people on board? And I am confident when a couple years from now, when people look back on this, the Oversight Board, there may be terrible things that can be said about it. There may be all kinds of vices and weaknesses and flaws, but I do not think not being independent of Facebook is going to be on the list. The 20 people who are on the initial board have no connection with Facebook. Many of them have spent their careers criticizing Facebook. I have absolutely nothing to do with Facebook. I don't care about the company. I don't care what they think. It's just completely, to me, just another entity out there. If anything, I think there may be too much hostility to to Facebook among many of the board members. And board members are from all over the world. There are 20 currently. Of 5 of them are Americans. Americans are heavily tilted toward law professors, by the way, not so much so the rest of the world. And all of the continents are represented. 29 languages represented. There are people of various types of experience, ideologically, professionally. They're former journalists, they're lawyers. There's a former prime minister of Denmark. There's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. There's the longtime editor of the Guardian newspaper. It's a pretty diverse bunch. But one thing I really can say from personal experience is that being beholden to Facebook is not their problem, not their thing. So that's who they are. The big problem is the biggest weakness in this institutional structure is that to give a good, solid, sober, intelligent answer to the questions takes time. And that means that the board can only decide a relatively small number of cases. The board opened its doors to user appeals in October of 2020. They've accepted 15, decided 12. By the way, of the 12 cases that have been decided, 9 of them reversed Facebook's decisions. The cases come in 4 different flavors. The most common are user appeals, where somebody has been shut down, where their post has been removed, and they appeal that. But then more recently, it's become possible to take appeals from people who think that somebody else's post should have been taken down and weren't. So those cases where people object to what they consider to be offensive or dangerous materials will be part of it. Facebook referrals are an important part, where Facebook itself realizes that a case raises a hard problem. They're not quite sure what the right answer is. They kick it over. The Trump case, the most important one so far, was a Facebook referral. And then finally, we've just gotten the first one of these, Facebook also can ask for guidance on a general question of policy. So their first one of those just came in the door, and it has to do with doxing and when, what are the proper lines between when truthful but personal identification can be, like what residential addresses, for example, can be should be taken down, and when they can be left up. Obviously, a very tricky question, because often this is, has to do with political organizing and demonstrations and protests, but also can be a very damaging and dangerous form of invasion of privacy. Let me just give you a flavor of what's been done so far, and then I'm going to subside and open it up for questions. But the board has tried to take cases that raise broad questions so that they aren't just, so it isn't, and the idea is that the cases will have some sort of precedential importance. Just a few examples. I think one of the most recent, maybe the most recent case handed down, comes out of Russia, and involving bitter dispute over within the Facebook pages over a description of a protest demonstration in Leningrad on behalf of Navalny. And the Facebook has a rule that any individual person, which means not a public official, essentially. I mean, it's a more complicated definition, but that's the most important part of it. A private person has the right not to have their name bandied about in a pejorative way. The word in the Facebook policy is negative characterization. And this is a privacy protection. It's kind of we don't really have an American equivalent to this, but it's a little bit more like European ideas of a kind of moral ownership over yourself and your identity and your and so forth. And so the Facebook policy is, if you're a private person and somebody is saying bad things about you, you just have a right to have it taken down, period. No questions asked. Well, the problem is that this Navalny, and arose in this Navalny matter, was that they are debating an extremely important public matter, public policy, that is having to do with the protests about Navalny. And both sides are sort of being insulting about the other. One side is more sophisticated about Facebook's policies and succeeded in getting all their opponents' posts taken down. Well, the Oversight Board reversed this, but not just in this particular case, but urged Facebook to change its policy to recognize that not only do people have a right to criticize public officials and public figures, but they also should have the right to criticize private people in the course of debating matters of public importance. This is, for those people who know American constitutional law, these matters were debated in the US Supreme Court in the mid-1960s, and the decision rendered in this Navalny case largely represents the conclusion that the Supreme Court came to in the mid-1960s about defamation in the context of matters of public importance. And so I mention this because although the First Amendment doesn't apply in any sort of strict legal sense, the jurisprudence under the First Amendment is so often quite illuminating as an intelligent way of thinking about what the problems are here. And so I think this case is an interesting example of that. Another case involved a slur term in another language against Azerbaijani people. And I'm not even going to describe the slur because I don't understand it. But the point is that under Facebook's policy, if somebody uses one of these listed number of slurs, that there's actually a secret list of slurs, that means that the entire post comes down. Well, the post involved here was a potentially very important, I don't know if it's true or not, but a very important criticism of the Azerbaijani government, which recently took over a portion of Armenia called Nagorno-Karabakh. And according to the Post, they are allowing the destruction of churches in this area. And there were a bunch of photographs and so forth. But anyway, the entire post was taken down because of the slur. And the Oversight Board decision about this was, it's one thing, okay, about the slurs, we get slurs, you can take down slurs, but if you're going to take down a post because it contains one slur, you should immediately notify the user so that they can repost the material minus the slur. Because in this case, this potentially, very important, bit of political advocacy having to do with the destruction of churches and in this occupied portion that was formerly part of Armenia. It was down for 3 or 4 months, and the user had no way of knowing why it was down. So this isn't just a matter of transparency or user friendliness, although those two things are not unimportant. It's a really important free speech issue, because if your post is taken down for a specific, easily curable reason, you need to be told the reason so that you can get it back up. I mentioned we had a case about satire. Well, satire is a really big problem. And essentially our solution to this is a case where the Facebook took down something that it was pretty obviously satirical. But the human moderators were not so sure. I think it's partly because of their cultural unawareness of the situation that was being satirized, has to do with the Armenian genocide in Turkey. Anyway, our suggestion here was that people need to be able to, if their posts are taken down as involving hate speech, and in fact what it was is satire, they need to be given the option to say, wait a minute, this is satire. There are a couple of other exceptions to the hate speech policy, but they need to be able to identify those and get the matter to a responsible human decision maker quickly, because machines are just incapable of making a reliable decision on this. Now, this involves expenditure on Facebook's part, but at least in the opinion of the board, this is something where Facebook needs to spend some more money, that they can't just rely upon artificial intelligence in certain areas. Artificial intelligence has been great for enabling them to be more responsive on a lot of different dimensions, but they need to be more careful. Well, in my notes here, I have about 3 or 4 other cases I was going to describe, but I think I'll skip them in order to get to questions. But the case that everyone is most familiar with, and I'm sure around the world people have been most concerned about, is the Trump takedown case. And I'll just say a couple things about that. The most important thing I think many critics have not understood is that the Oversight Board is not the we're not ourselves the gatekeeper. What we are doing is reviewing Facebook's decision. So we are trying to make Facebook accountable along the dimensions of transparency and consistency and clarity. And so from the point of view of the board, this was not a case about Trump. It really isn't our job to decide, is Trump's speech dangerous? Is Trump and so forth. Our job was to decide whether Facebook's treatment of the Trump matter comported with both community standards and norms of freedom of expression. And our conclusion was that the initial decision to take him off, and because of his posts on January 6th, was justified, although his posts contained some, I think, perfunctory calls to peaceful action. They basically were praising the rioters at the Capitol. We now know, by the way, from if you read the indictments and various prosecutions of participants in the riot, just how central it was to their decision to do this that the president of the United States was egging them on. There's testimony from some of these people that say things like, we had the permission of the president of the United States, and we were responding to his call, and so forth and so on. So Trump knew what he was doing, and when he and the board's conclusion was that the Facebook was justified in holding that this was that these messages were serious violations of the standards, and thus that he should come down. But we said the decision to keep him off indefinitely does not comport with the standards, and it does not comport with international norms of freedom of expression. What Facebook did is they took him off, and then they announced he would be off for at least 2 weeks. That's in time enough to make sure that the violence has died down, and then indefinite, and then maybe indefinite beyond that. And before the 2 weeks was over, they kicked the case over to the Facebook Oversight Board, saying, "You decide." Well, essentially what they were doing is avoiding accountability by saying, "Oversight Board, you make the decision." And our response was, "No, it isn't our job to make the decision. Our job is to review your decision, and that this indefinite suspension is both contrary to your own rules, but also, really quite dangerous to freedom of speech, because when any speaker, and especially perhaps somebody of a prominent political position, is either off or on at the whim of the company at any moment, without any reason, without any knowledge of whether they'll be on tomorrow or not, that's just holding, that's exercising excessive, unlimited discretion with respect to the account. And that is not one of the important sort of underlying procedural aspects of freedom of speech is you need to have rules. People need to know where they stand, and those rules need to be enforced consistently across people, so that you treat different people the same way. And indefinite suspensions are inconsistent with that. We gave them 6 months to look at the matter again, get their rules in order. Instead, they decided fairly quickly, I forget now exactly how many weeks it was, but they didn't take the full 6 months, and they decided to keep Trump off for a defined 2-year period. And that's whether that's a good decision or not isn't really, it hasn't been brought to the board. So, I don't know. I don't have an official opinion about that one way or the other. But they did do what we said, which was give a definite answer on one way or the other, and and be prepared to apply the same standards to similarly situated people around the world. So that's, I think, a modest advance. Now, this is certainly not a panacea for all the problems of social media. We don't even pretend that it is. There are all kinds of psychological and democratic problems with social media that the Facebook Oversight Board doesn't even begin to address. But I do hope, and at this point I'm pretty cautiously optimistic, that having somebody looking over their shoulders and saying, well, what does your rule mean? Is it consistent? Are you really treating like cases alike? I think it's already having a positive effect, and it's something that will be in the interest both of users and of the democratic nations in which Facebook operates. It may even be in the economic interests of the company as well. So thank you. And
Okay, thank you so much, Michael, and especially for going back to freedom of the press and the glorious revolution at the beginning. I appreciate that. But Condi has been able to join us, and I thought it would be good if she could give some introductory remarks as if she was here at the beginning. So Condi, want to say a few things, and then Amy will handle the Q&A.
Well, thanks very much, and I'm sorry for being late joining. I got stuck on another Zoom. These seem to just pile up one after another these days. I'm sure you all have experienced that. Michael, thank you very much for really an excellent presentation. And I think what we've just seen is why it's so important for us to have this group on technology, economics, and governance, because we are facing in our country and around the world challenges from technology that would never have been anticipated by the institutions that were, or by the founders and framers of the institutions. And I think very good example, I love the reference to the Glorious Revolution. Of course, the founding fathers would never have dreamed of the kind of challenge that Facebook has just faced about what to do with a sitting president who appears to be engaging in behavior that is not only probably not up to their standards, but against most constitutional standards. That you would have a private company involved in the management of that issue is just extraordinary. And so really important for us to deal with all of these technological challenges and how they are challenging our institutions. Michael, your discussion reminds me that one thing this group can do is to look at something like the Facebook board. You're right, we probably are going to have more institutions like this trying to fill the void for what government can't do and probably shouldn't do, and how to think about these institutional mechanisms or inventions that are coming about to try to fill this void is probably something that we ought to be paying attention to, because we think of it as institutions that are extant. But of course, what will happen is that new institutional forms will begin to emerge to try to bridge the gap between where we are and where the institutions are. I'm just going to ask Michael one question, but Michael, you can take questions from a few people if you would like first. I've actually been really interested in what's been going on with this question about misinformation and how to think about misinformation, because obviously Facebook and a lot of others had egg on their face about the Wuhan laboratory leak theory, and whether or not having an arbitrator decide what is fact and what isn't fact might be even more difficult than some of the questions that you face about free speech. So in any case, I will turn it back over to Amy, who's going to conduct the Q&A.
Amy, would you like me to
Michael,
talk
would you
about
like
this
to
information?
would you like to respond to that before we go? I'll just say for the queue, I have Herb, then Lee, and then Dan and Jack. Do you want to respond to Condi's question first, or do you want to take more?
Yeah, let me do that. I've been saying from the beginning, actually, Jack, I see Jack Goldsmith here. He and I had a conversation, public conversation about this very thing. I think misinformation is the most dangerous of all of the categories in which the companies are active, because and again, I look at the experience. It's not, again, that the First Amendment applies, but this country, we have such experience dealing with some of these things. And misinformation has been the subject of, I don't know, 20 Supreme Court decisions, maybe, from different angles. Like the most important modern decision, really the beginning of modern First Amendment law, was New York Times against Sullivan, which is about disinformation, false information, and what to be done about that. And what we know is, of course, false information is bad for the users. It creates all kinds of problems. It's bad for democracy. If all we had were truth, it would be, we would be in a much better situation. But the danger of trying to root out disinformation is so severe. And what is disinformation? This Wuhan lab example is is classic. So far, the Oversight Board has only decided one case that I would say is really about this issue, and it was about COVID disinformation or misinformation. It was a French case in which the post had to do with criticizing the French government, the health authorities, for their refusal to recognize the name of that substance you've all heard, the hydroxychloroquine or whatever. I can never remember the right chemical term for it. And Facebook took this down, and the Oversight Board reversed that, saying that this was not urging people to use the substance. It was a criticism of the health authorities for their decision-making with respect to the substance. And in France, at least, where this post was, all of this was handled by prescriptions anyway, so there's a protection against individually harmful uses, and so it should be restored. Well, Facebook restored it, as they said, but it's the only case so far where Facebook has pushed back and said they don't, although they're complying with our decision, they don't really agree with it, because they're very committed to the idea that experts know the best about COVID, and that it's dangerous to have any debate, even of this sort of quasi-scientific sort. Of course, at Stanford, and even at Hoover, we've had similar issues. So this is I think it's emblematic of how difficult this is. This has really been the first and only so far source of tension. Just one more thing about it is that Facebook uses panels of outside, they have like 30 some odd outfits that are fact checkers for disinformation, usually not leading to taking down posts, but rather to labeling them as questionable. And I really look forward to having a case involving that come to the Oversight Board, because I think this is a deeply flawed system, and that I understand why Facebook wants to outsource these questions to supposed experts, but I think they need to be more careful not to be empowering advocacy groups in the name of expertise.
Great. So next I have Herb Lynn.
Hi, that was just a fascinating talk, and raised all kinds of issues, and I could take up the rest of the day talking to you about it. So I'm not going to do that. You just in your remarks just a minute ago, you mentioned takedown and labeling as two remedies, two actions that Facebook could take in response to this question of misinformation. But I guess it applies more broadly. What I'm wondering is whether there's room in your charter, or in maybe Facebook's ability to execute or willingness to execute, for a variety of other, I don't want to say penalties necessarily, but responsive actions to not to take down, but to dampen the effect of violations of the rules. Takedown is of course the most extreme. You can suppress something and nobody sees it, but you could slow it down. For example, you could prevent it's going viral. You can introduce more friction into the process, for example, but that doesn't seem to be something that people want to be able to do. And what I'm wondering is whether the extent to which you have the ability to recommend such intermediate measures that are more forceful than labeling and less forceful than Takedown?
Not yet, at least in the course of these ordinary case appeals. Now, there is this fourth category where our first one, the doxing situation, is the first one we have confronted. And it's quite possible Facebook might, throw that kind of a question to us in a general way. But I say not yet, in that we begin with take-ups and leave, takedowns and leave-ups. They're the most straightforward, but we are gradually, talking to Facebook about the other types of decision, and it would not surprise me if over time the scope of the charter is increased. I think thus far, even though we have basically overturned the vast majority of the cases that come to us, I think that Facebook is still rather happy with that. I think, in a sense, they don't. What they want is to have a system which has public credibility. That's more important to them than being able to decide things, each individual case, any way. And if the board retains credibility, I think that the scope is likely to increase, to broaden. And Herb, I think you're entirely right. Some of these intermediate remedies may be the most important, but not yet.
But you can only address them to the extent that Facebook introduces them, or can you introduce them into the dialogue yourself? I guess that's really my question.
We cannot. It would have to require cooperative work with Facebook. The charter is what it is, and we don't have authority to expand our authority without Facebook agreeing to. This whole thing is a voluntary process, right? And so Facebook has agreed to cede final decision-making authority over certain matters, and we don't have the power to force them to give us power over anything else.
Okay.
I mean, another example that we don't have scope over is paid advertising, and yet that raises lots of issues.
Okay. Thank you.
So the queue is getting longer, Michael, which is always a good sign. The next I have Lee Ohanian.
Michael, thank you very much for the really fascinating talk. As a legal layperson, and I hope my question is not too naive, I'm just wondering to what extent are libel or defamation types of protective laws, are these somehow, are social media platforms somehow immune to these types of laws? I'm just thinking back to your remarks about the post regarding a slur, and as a related question, to what extent would case law regarding things such as newspapers or television productions or radio, to what extent are those informative or not informative about social media related issues?
In the United States, there is a statute which is called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that immunizes social media companies from liability for the content that their users have. And so no matter how libelous something is on Facebook, Facebook cannot be sued. Now, the person who posts that can be sued, but not Facebook. And this points to a very deep, important question that I almost was going to talk about at the beginning, which is when you look at the different media of communications, the social media companies are in a sense privileged over others, because you have straightforward common carriers like telephone and telegraph that simply where the companies have no discretion over what's transmitted. And then you have things like newspapers that have total discretion over what's communicated, but subject to liability if they publish defamation, for example. So they're and the social media companies under Section 230 have total discretion, but without the liability. And there's no other entity that is in that position.
Dan Kessler, you're next.
Thanks. So, Michael, I mean, I realize you're in an almost impossible position here with this situation, but I guess, taking a step back, I'm, as a non-professional in this area, I mean, I'm still a little troubled that the President of the United States, with whom I don't agree, of course, is still barred from using the service for 2 years. I mean, how is that? I mean, I would be, I don't know the details, but I would be surprised if that's really treating light cases in a like fashion, given the sort of inflammatory speech that we see constantly from people who don't agree with President Trump. So I mean, I hear what you're saying, but taking a step back, I struggle to understand how, this sort of outcome sits with you.
So, maybe it's true that private companies shouldn't have this kind of power. But the oversight board doesn't, that's above our pay grade. I think there actually are reasons why all the alternatives are maybe worse. Our job is to look at how that kind of power is exercised and to try to bring it within understandable rules that are consistently applied. Now, Dan, you expressed skepticism that this was truly consistently applied, and I can't tell you it really is. So far, this was a one-of-a-kind situation, and you can only ask yourself hypotheticals. What would have happened if it had been somewhat if the parties have been changed or something else was the case? You certainly, there are going to be some examples abroad. One of probably the biggest black eye Facebook ever justifiably got, that is where the criticism was justified but really severe, had to do when leaders in the Myanmar government incited violence against the Muslim minority group within the country, and pogroms broke out, and Facebook, the material was right there on Facebook. So Facebook was basically the medium for organizing a pogrom, and and Facebook, I think, is quite determined not to have anything like that happen again. Well, January 6th was not a pogrom, but it was a very serious thing. I don't really think we can compare it to, just a riot. I mean, the United States has riots from time to time, but the particular attempt to frustrate the constitutional process of counting votes for the transition of power in the United States, it's never happened before. I remember when, I'm no tremendous fan of Donald Trump, but I remember when my more left-wing friends were saying he's going to try to prevent the election from prevent an election from taking force. I scoffed. I just couldn't imagine, you know, what everyone thought of Donald Trump. That just seemed to be off the table. That was like that's something no legitimate player in the American process would do. And here we are. So, you know, how do we compare it? Is it comparable? I don't know. I hope we never have anything to compare it to.
So can I just jump in here? I'm sorry, Amy, but what about competition? So Trump was also, the Parler thing didn't work. So is that an answer here that you can go somewhere else? What do you think about competition here, Mike?
I don't know. A lot of people, I think, confuse antitrust issues with the free speech issues having to do with social media, and they think that somehow the antitrust stuff will solve the communication stuff. I'm very skeptical. I think that one of the reasons why so many people are on Facebook is that so many people are on Facebook, and that if you like broke it up into 20 companies, that it just wouldn't be performing the service that its users want. And that makes me wonder if it isn't some kind of a monopoly because of network effects. So Parler didn't work. Parler did work in a sense. Parler was taken off. I think the suppression of Parler should be as controversial as the suppression of Donald Trump. It's something we really ought to be seriously thinking about. And I do worry that things that are becoming monopolistic that don't have to be, like book distribution. I mean, how terrible is it that one company, every bookstore decides what books they're going to have, and some of them do that on the basis of ideological or other considerations. But as long as there are lots of bookstores, nobody cares. When there's one bookstore, that's an awful lot of power to decide what books the American public are going to be able to buy. But Facebook and Amazon strike me as slightly different, because it doesn't seem to me that the network effects are as obvious. Network advantages to the user base are as obvious in one case as they are in the other. I think it's interesting politically that just in the last few days that Congress is actively considering a number of pieces of legislation. All of them are addressed to the concentration monopoly problem, and most of them have absolutely nothing to do with the content moderation problem, and won't have any, I don't think will have any serious effects on that.
So now I'm going to violate my own rules. If I could follow up on John Taylor's question, Michael, and then we'll get back to the queue. Knowing now what you know about Facebook in particular, you've gotten a ringside seat to a variety of issues that most people don't. How do you think about whether the government should take additional action to deal with the problems of Facebook in particular and social media, whether it's disinformation or the undermining of democracy and the use of the platform by foreign actors? Has your mind changed? And if so, where are you right now?
I still don't see how the government can get into this consistent in an intelligent way, consistently with the First Amendment. So take, for example, the idea of treating like cases alike, which I think is one of the most important things that the Oversight Board should be doing. The government is in no position to make those judgments. When it tried to do that under the Fairness Doctrine, it was a mess. And, you know, what is consistency? It's so much in the eye of the beholder. And when the eye of the beholder is somebody appointed by the president, and it's going to be the eye of the party in power. And that scares me more than anything Facebook does.
On that note, we'll turn now back to the list. Jack Goldsmith.
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me?
I can.
I loved your presentation. I basically agreed with everything you said for what it's worth. And I agree that Facebook is not perfect in by large measure in policing speech, but I think it's probably on balance, given the other things going on, better than the government, even assuming the government could do this consistent with the First Amendment. It seems to me that the substantive standard you're applying, some combination to these various cases, is some combination of Facebook community norms and international human rights norms. And it's important to remember that your jurisdiction runs globally and Facebook operates globally. Those norms, just being very reductive, are less protective of speech than US First Amendment ideas, but they're much more protective of speech that go on in lots of countries. So it seems to me what we're having is the Europeanization of speech across all of these platforms globally. It seems that's where we're headed. And it's a conception of speech that's less tolerant of so-called harmful speech, less tolerant of so-called misinformation and the like. And we've been talking about the consequences of that for the United States and whether that's good or bad. But I want to ask you about the other end of that. And that is, first of all, you've been a force for, compared to the baseline of what Facebook's been doing. The Oversight Board has been a force thus far for expanded freedom of speech. I just wonder what you think is going to happen with your cases in the more authoritarian states, or the democracies that have more authoritarian tendencies, or that are less speech protective, like India, Brazil, and Turkey. Because it seems to me that ultimately you're on a kind of collision course, that your decisions applying these norms are going to make it hard for Facebook to actually do business in those countries. I just wonder if you could just talk about the other side of things, not the consequences for the United States, but the consequences of what you're doing for places like Turkey and India, Brazil, and places like that.
Well, already Facebook can't do business in China.
Right.
Now, China is a large enough and technologically advanced enough society that they're creating their own alternatives to Facebook. And chances are that's going to be worse for freedom of speech around the world than the problems we're talking about. I can only predict that that the Oversight Board is likely to have more spine with respect to the authoritarian regimes you refer to than it is with the sort of soft progressive authoritarianism that exists in other parts of the world. And I'm not at all sure that the Oversight Board has the gumption to stand up to that.
Sorry, just one quick follow-up. What exactly, I just haven't figured this out. What exactly is Facebook's commitment to the board is to honor your decisions about takedowns and things like that? Is that correct? But is it just limited to like particular cases or to the precedent? Or if you say that they took something down in India and it was wrong, they have to put that back up, but the principle, do they have to follow the principle in your decisions?
I'm trying to think of what the specific statement is, and I can't actually, I can't give you a precise answer to that. My generalized understanding is that they are committed to, excuse me, I'm in a very dry climate right here, is that they're committed to applying the precedents as well. But, you know, we're law professors, Jack, and you know how malleable the idea of precedent is. So although I think they're committed to that, that doesn't, you know, right. in the end, if they don't agree with it, I'm thinking it's going to be very hard to hold them to that. I think the real force of the Oversight Board, therefore, has to do with the force of our explanations. And thus far, with the exception of the French COVID case, I think Facebook has tended to see the logic in what is suggested. And I really think that's a good thing. Sometimes soft power is better than hard power. And, you know, if we are influential only insofar as our decisions make sense, we have an incentive to make sense. And in some ways, that's better, because, you know, anybody with final power has a tendency to become arbitrary. The reason why we're less likely to be arbitrary is we have to explain ourselves.
We're now at the speed dating round, Michael, of our session, since we have about 5 minutes left and we have 3 people in the queue. So I'm going to ask Jackie, Manny, and Doug if you could each say your question, and then Michael, you get to decide what you want to respond to and how much time you want to devote to each question. So we'll go one by one, Jackie, Manny, and then Doug, and then Michael, you get the last word.
Thanks, Amy. And it's a little hard going after Jack, because I was exactly going to jump on this idea and this discussion of norms. But just briefly, I was really interested, as you were talking, Michael, about how this oversight board really becomes a norm entrepreneur, almost maybe unintentionally, right? But I'm interested, we talked a little about the tension between kind of an American perspective and these different, the European perspective and these other countries, but also I'm interested as this idea of an oversight board maybe becomes more popular and starts being adopted by social media companies that are not necessarily American and definitely not Facebook. Kind of, do you see there being kind of competition and the interaction between oversight boards as like competing norm entrepreneurs, especially if they're based, you know, in Europe versus the United States?
I had a really quick question, I think, that ties in together the competition issue with the curation issue that Herb kind of brought up earlier. And I'm wondering if really this Section 230 problem or question is really at the center of a lot of this. I know you're doubtful of the competition and free speech issues being related, but if you think about curation as being the product that's being offered by Facebook, right, which is a different curation that's offered than that on Twitter and TikTok and so on, isn't in fact the lack of competition what produces kind of the opacity really in, you know, how amplification happens, who gets dampened, who goes viral? Isn't this really analogous to, you know, being subscribed to a single newspaper, disagreeing with the editorial policy, but not even having any choice in it? I mean, that's really my question, whether you think that in fact there might be a connection there.
My question was about the same as Jack and Jackie, so I'd rather hear Mike talk.
I love the idea of competitive norm entrepreneurs, and already I think the Oversight Board is beginning to be that. So far, it hasn't been competition among other oversight boards, which I would welcome, but it is competition with other people who purport to interpret international norms of freedom of expression, like the UN Human Rights Commissions, on which so many authoritarian governments, you know, are represented. And you know, the international norms are written in very broad ways, that are subject to lots of interpretation. Jack presented the conventional wisdom that they're not as protective of freedom of speech as in the United States, and I'm sure that that's true. But there's lots of room for interpretation. One of the things that I think that I do is to try to bring not First Amendment law into this, but First Amendment values and understandings and norms and experience and sophistication to some of this. And I would, you know, I love the thought that, you know, maybe in the future people will read our opinions and then they'll look at the UN Special Rapporteur and then they'll look at something else and they'll say, well, here are some ways in which we can understand freedom of expression as a global proposition. It had been suggested that maybe other social media companies might actually use this oversight board to do a similar function for them. And I know some people would like that. I personally would rather see them set up their own, precisely because I believe in competitive norms. And this might be the sort of situation in which the best ideas rise to the top, because it's not mob driven and it's not advertiser driven. It's a more discursive competition, and that's the best kind, I think. So so I love that question, Jackie. Manny, I expressed my skepticism about the connection between monopoly issues and free speech issues, but I don't have any great confidence in it. Let's you and I talk about this in the future, and others talk about it, because it could be that there's more to this connection than I've been giving credit thus far. So, and your analogy to single newspapers in town is kind of a haunting analogy, because that's the way speech, I mean, on many local issues for much of our history, that's been the way it is. And we have increasing monopolization in that space. Already social media has broken that down a little bit, because people read newspapers now that can't be delivered on their doorsteps. I used to read the newspaper that came to my house, and now I read the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Salt Lake Tribune, sometimes even the San Francisco Chronicle. So, and in that sense, I'm with you that more voices are good to prevent monopolization of ideas. There is this further problem, though. Let me just put this on our agenda for future conversation too, which is the suspiciously similar worldviews that many of these institutions seem to have. So, is Twitter really different from Facebook? Aren't they being run by people of similar sensibilities? Is the competition there really doing what we would want it to do? Parler was different. Parler was silenced.
Michael, this has been just a terrific session. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Great questions, everyone. And our grand scheme of kicking off our working group by having you talk to us was a really good idea. So thank you for getting us started on the right foot. Appreciate everyone's time, and especially Michael Mcconnell. Thank you for doing heroes work on this Facebook Oversight board, where you'll be upsetting half the country no matter what you do. Thanks so much.